Hi, Misha here, and let's do another Russian armor video. And this time, let's talk about the light floating tank. We have the PT76 and the updated PT76B here. Both are 1/72 scale, and they're from Fabry/Eagle Moss, depending on if you're in Russia or the USA. It's an interesting tank, and it's Russia's return to using light tanks, although in a different role than they would have in the 1930s or even 1940s. And these actually were seen quite extensively by U.S. soldiers and even U.S. armor in Vietnam between 68 and 72, give or take. Probably their biggest claim to fame. So, yeah, let's talk about it. So, on to the spinny thingy we go. In World War II and right after, Russia really had no use for light tanks. It really put all of its cards into medium tanks with whatever was left over, focusing on a few heavy tanks. But they were basically going into the MBT concept, whether they knew it or not at the time. And of course, the Type 54 would be a major success based on the Type, and I said Type, I apologize. T54 would be a major success based on the T44. I've been doing Japanese tank videos, the T and Type and thing, and yeah. There you go. Anyway, the T44 based on the late model T34, did a video on that a while back. You can check it out. So at first they really didn't have a need for a new light tank. But in the late 40s, they reconsidered. Things were changing. They thought having a light tank maybe wasn't such a bad idea after all. But one new wrinkle. It needed to be amphibious. Again, Russia had played around with that with the original T-37, T-38, even T-40, but World War II kind of caused that feature to be dropped, going to the T-60, T-70, and so on and so forth. The idea now, the light tank would be for reconnaissance, mainly, with fire support and infantry support and whatnot as secondary auxiliary roles. And several designs, concepts were, sketched out and even prototypes built in the late 40s. And in 1949, the concept of Object 740 is unveiled. In 1950, a prototype was built, and on August 6, 1951, the Object 740 was adopted as the PT76, beating out all the other tanks and becoming Russia's first light tank in a few years at least, and put into production at the Stalingrad tractor factory that year. And as usually happens with Russian production, the first version was low rate so they could kind of work out bugs. Now this model is of the early version. These were produced between 1951 and 1959. The 76 in the name is for the gun. This has a 76.2 millimeter main gun. So like the original Type 34. It would carry 40 rounds, a mix of high explosive and heat and armor piercing, what have you. Its secondary armament was a 7.62 machine gun with 1,000 rounds. Originally, it was the SGMT machine gun. There's no top hatch there. Overall, we're at about 7.6 some odd meters long, about 25 feet, so not teeny tiny, and we're at about 14.5 tons, give or take. They had to kind of keep the weight down as best they could because this was designed to be aquatic. At the time, it used quite a new water jet system in the back here. That was for going over water and steering and everything else. Some other aquatic amphibious vehicles would use their tracks, but nope, this used water jets. Going over land, it's a 6-cylinder engine, which was kind of funnily enough, essentially a T-54's 12-cylinder cut in half. It could get up to about 44, 45 kilometers per hour on road. And that would drop into the 20-somethings off-road, depending on how rough the terrain was. But over water, it could exceed 10 kilometers per hour, which is actually quite good for water, because this was designed to be amphibious from the get-go. So the shape of the hull is kind of boat-like. It's designed to be smooth. Those water jets were very helpful. And like I said, they did keep the weight down. One thing they did do, the wheels were hollow for both better drainage and for weight. That's a good thing. But another compromise, they had to go to some relatively light armor. The heaviest, the thickest armor is on the turret face, and it's just about an inch, 25 millimeters. The rest of the turret is a little under at about 20 millimeters, and then the rest of the tank is about half an inch, anywhere from 10 to 14 millimeters. And then a few parts are getting close to a quarter inch at about 7 millimeters. This armor was not designed to take any kind of heavy hit. It was designed to protect against 30 caliber rounds. It wasn't even designed to protect against 50 cal, 12.7 millimeter machine gun fire. It could protect against small fragments and splinters, but not large ones. So they knew what they were doing. It was a compromise, but it could float and go relatively fast over the water. It could go about 400 kilometers range on internal fuel, but even from the very outset, it could have up to 4 external tanks, 2 kind of flat and 2 of these cylindrical ones. If we added these fuel tanks, we could extend that a little over 500 kilometers for range. So, yeah. Had a crew of 3. We had the driver kind of front and center in the hull. And then we had a 2-man turret with the loader. And then the poor commander did triple duty, really. He would command, he would be the gunner, and he would be the radio operator. Kind of how it goes. To be fair, some early light tanks were 2 men, so at least he did have a loader. But it was a lot for him to do. But again, saving on weight, space, all that does add up. My cat is rubbing me, so it is rather distracting at the same time. So, like I said, a radio was standard. Also, the driver had a night vision, or at least thermal periscope he could mount at night, but the commander and gunner would not have any kind of night vision to speak of. Obviously, there's no real air defense as such. Interestingly, unlike previous Russian amphibious tanks, this one was rated to go into the ocean. Probably not as good as the Japanese Type 2, but it could at least go into salt water. And from the beginning, what the powers that be in Russia wanted, it was a tank that could go into the water with very little preparation. They didn't want something that needed to behave like a transformer. It needed to be able to just, get up and go. Because, again, reconnaissance and being able to be mobile. If they were going to go to a relatively small gun, at least by the standards of the 50s, and light armor, they were at least going to get speed and agility out of it. And, to that end, they were pretty successful. So it was under relatively low rate production in 1951, 52. And then in 1957, the original PT76 Model 1 would be replaced by the PT76 Model 2. This had a few updates. For one, they raised the hull a little bit. Not much. We're talking like, half an inch. They also added a fume extractor for the gun, and they went to an updated version of the main gun. Very similar, but it was stabilized on one axis. But the PT76 did not have nuclear, biological, chemical, radiation, everything protection. When it was first introduced, that wasn't too uncommon, but by the mid and late 50s, Russian military vehicles were increasingly expected to have this level of defense. So while the older Model 1s were being updated to the Model 2 standard and Model 2s were being produced, work was already underway for a more substantial improvement, which would be introduced in 1959. Meet the PT76B. And if this looks very similar to the previous model, you're not wrong. Most of the differences are very minor and have to do with the gun and the turret. And they're, of course, internal. The updates, well, they were important, but this wasn't a major step forward. In 1959, yeah, the B was introduced, replacing the original version on the production lines. It went to yet another a modernization of the gun, now being stabilized with 2 axes. By the way, these guns introduced in 57 have a double Baffle muzzle brake, which is kind of cool. And they would make a few other minor improvements, but of course the big one, it was finally NBC protected to kind of get in line with the rest of the Soviet armor at the time. And mass production would really be cranking up at this point and run through the 1960s. In 1967, there would be another small update. The old 7.62 SGMT coax machine gun would be replaced with the newer 7.62 PKT tank machine gun. That's basically the Kalashnikov general purpose machine gun made for a tank. Still has 1,000 rounds. Not much else to be said about that. And that would actually come late in production because manufacturing would halt around 1969. Although I would imagine during refurbishment and repair, older SGMTs would be replaced with that. This would equip Russia and become its primary reconnaissance tank, used by the Army, also by the Marines in Russia. It was also used for fire support, infantry support. It was also used to help secure beach landings, beach operations, to help establish a beachhead, and to support artillery. Perhaps more importantly, this floating chassis here would be used as the basis for many other vehicles, including the ASU-85, the Airborne's next generation of self-propelled artillery, also some anti-aircraft, and actually the next vehicle we're going to talk about in the next video after this one, so stay tuned for that. So it was really kind of the jumping off point, and it would remain the standard even well after production was over in the Soviet Union, and it would be exported to pretty much all of the Warsaw Pact allies in Eastern Europe, being one of their reconnaissance tanks. It would also be exported to friendly nations outside of, the direct Warsaw Pact there, for example, Iraq, Syria, India. And for military service, most importantly, a large number would end up in North Vietnamese Army service. By the way, on these models, they're nothing super special, but they do some affordable, good example pieces, and we do have moving turrets on these, and some of them even feature moving guns, although this one doesn't. The hull is all metal, turret's plastic, and the tracks, the treads, are rubber. It's kind of neat. And sometimes the wheels on these are metal, sometimes they're plastic. It just depends on the detail level. Again, This is not a Hobby Master model, but they're not Hobby Master prices. They're like $10. So for a, 3-inch, 4-inch long tank, it's not bad for a Soviet collection. Anyway, these would first encounter American tanks in 1968, going up against primarily M48s. And it won't, surprise you to know that generally speaking, the PT76 would not come on top there. Part of it was its own light armor. Part of it was its relatively light gun. On the other hand, it did have mobility and speed on its side, and it was able to damage a few M48s, but usually at the cost of several PT76s being totally knocked out or outright destroyed. And in 1969, that would be the biggest tank-on-tank engagement, and really one of the only in Vietnam. And in 1972, the PT-76 would be the unfortunate first victim of the, at the time, new TOW missile system, which was carried on board some UH-1, some Hueys. And they would like to go plinking with their new found weapons in April and May of that year, and so on and so forth, and they would take down quite a large number of PT-76s. But if you think about it, a relatively small, relatively light tank able to go over water is not the worst thing in the world to have an environment like Vietnam. Large, heavy tanks. Yeah, they had their purposes in certain areas in Vietnam, but other places, it's just, some reason the Japanese Type 95 and Type 97 met with some success in World War II. Anyway, these would remain in foreign service for decades, and in fact, some foreign militaries still have some PT-76s knocking about today. Allegedly, even Russia, especially the Marines, still have a few at least in reserve. And let's end with them back together. Yeah, on the positive, good speed, good mobility, actually very at home in the water. But like a lot of light tanks, it had the negatives of very thin armor, not especially powerful, punchy main gun. But it was at the same time also quite simple, durable, dependable, and it was easy to mass produce. They built well over 10,000 of these. Most estimates put it at about 12,000, including all three of the major versions. And the original one was, well supplemented by getting the updates from the B, the protections and whatnot. But really the differences were pretty minor. They still lacked very good night vision fighting capabilities. Although the 2-axis stabilized gun, even if it wasn't powerful, at least was reasonably accurate. That said, the early versions really couldn't fire on the move. The later versions at least had a hope, but still yet, better to be still. But not always the most famous Russian tank, but I think its history and use in Vietnam, not to mention just throughout the Warsaw Pact, makes it something worth remembering and talking about. So let me know what you think. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And I will catch you very soon next time.